The band had just finished the number my mentor Roland Keyes requested for the 20th anniversary of Meridian Design Group, and Roland walked up to the microphone at the center of the ballroom, holding a glass of champagne in one hand and a folded sheet of paper in the other. And I remember thinking, in the second before he unfolded that paper, that it was strange he'd want notes for a toast he'd been giving versions of for 2 decades. 300 people were seated at round tables under a ceiling strung with warm gold lights. Clients and partners and every employee who had helped build the firm from a two-person operation into one of the most respected design studios in the state. And Roland tapped the microphone twice and said he had an announcement that couldn't wait until after dinner, because the people in this room deserved to understand exactly what kind of person had been quietly steering the creative direction of this company for the past 3 years. He said my name, Ava Delgado, and he said it slowly, with a warmth that I would only understand later was the most dangerous part. He told the room that he'd discovered, through a review he'd commissioned quietly over the past 2 months, that I had been funneling client work to a competitor, that 3 of our biggest accounts had received proposals from a rival studio that contained our proprietary concepts, concepts that lived on my drives signed off with my access credentials. He said it the way you deliver news about a death in the family, his hand pressed flat against his chest, his eyes actually wet. And I sat there at the head table with my fork halfway to my mouth and watched 299 people turn to look at me at the same time. A woman at the table nearest the stage set her wineglass down so hard the stem cracked. Nobody reached to help her. I looked out at the faces I knew best. Our lead developer, who had built 3 product launches with me, lowering his phone mid-photo. A client I'd worked with for 6 years, actually leaning back in his chair, as if to put distance between us. My husband Daniel, at a table near the side, rising halfway out of his seat before he caught my eye and understood that standing up would only make the theater worse. Roland kept talking, and the thing that unsettled me most was how prepared he sounded, how the sentences came out polished and grief-stricken at the same time. The product of a man who had rehearsed heartbreak in a mirror. He said the discovery had broken his heart, that mentoring me had been one of the great joys of his career, and that finding out what I'd done felt like losing a daughter, and he let his voice fail on the word daughter. And I watched 300 people believe him, because for 11 years, I had believed him too. The band members behind him stood with their instruments half lowered, unsure whether the song was over or the evening was, and a waiter carrying a tray of plated desserts stopped in the middle of the floor because there was nowhere in that room it felt right to keep moving. Roland Keyes had hired me 11 years earlier out of a design program where I was working 2 jobs to cover tuition. And for most of that time, he was the closest thing I had to family, in a city where I knew no one. The man who stayed late teaching me how to present to a nervous client, who covered my rent the month my car died, and I couldn't make it to 3 pitches, who introduced me at industry events as the best hire he'd ever made. What he never told those industry crowds was that it was my redesign of our entire brand identity system, 3 years into my time there, that pulled Meridian out of the slow bleed it had been in since the last recession, that the account everyone credited to his charm had actually come to us because a junior client of mine recommended us after I saved her product launch over a weekend I never billed for. Roland liked to tell the story of how he found me, a scrappy kid with more talent than sense, and he told it so often that even I started to believe the version where I owed him everything and he owed me nothing. I remember the year a major retail client threatened to walk 2 days before a launch because a print vendor had botched an entire run. And I spent 36 hours straight rebuilding the assets and driving to 3 different print shops myself. And when the client stayed, Roland stood up at the next staff meeting and described how he had personally salvaged the account. And I sat in the back and said nothing because I was 27 and grateful to have a job at all. I remember the design award we won our 6th year, the one that put Meridian on the national map, where my name was on the submission as lead, but Roland accepted the trophy alone on stage and thanked, in order, the board, the client, and his own late father, and never once said my name, and afterward told me privately that awards were about optics and a firm needed a single face. And I believed him because he said it like a lesson rather than a theft. I remember, too, the quiet afternoon 3 years before the gala when I brought him a proposal to formalize a partnership track, a real path for me to become a named principal. And he looked at it for a long moment and told me the timing wasn't right, that the firm was still fragile, that we'd revisit it soon, and we never did. And I let it go because I trusted that soon meant soon and not never. 2 years before that anniversary gala, at a holiday party, Roland's wife Diane had pulled me aside near the coat check, 2 glasses of wine past careful, and told me that Roland talked about me at home more than he talked about their own children, and that it wasn't always in a kind way, and that she thought I should know he kept a running list of every time a client asked for me by name instead of him. I didn't understand what she was warning me about then. I understood it completely the moment he unfolded that piece of paper and started reading my name into a microphone. What Roland did not know, what nobody in that ballroom knew, except 2 lawyers and a man named Theodore Ashworth who ran the private equity firm that had recapitalized Meridian 4 years earlier, was that when that recapitalization happened, back when the firm nearly went under and Roland went hunting for outside money to save it, I had quietly put in my own capital too, my entire savings, plus a loan against a small commercial property I'd inherited from my grandmother, structured through a holding entity with a deliberately forgettable name, in exchange for a silent equity stake that made me, on paper, the second largest individual owner of Meridian Design Group after Roland himself. I had done it because I believed in what we were building, and because Theodore Ashworth, reviewing the books during that near collapse, had told me privately that the firm's real value walked out the door every evening at 6, and her name was on my access badge, and that if I wanted to protect what I'd helped build, I should own a piece of it in a way Roland couldn't dilute or take back. I told nobody, not because I was ashamed, but because I understood Roland well enough to know that my visible success had a way of turning, in his mind, from something to celebrate into something to resent, and I wanted to protect the firm without triggering the exact reaction I was now watching unfold in real time. Theodore had structured the whole arrangement so that a public accusation of disloyalty against me, if it ever came, would trigger a governance review the board was contractually obligated to conduct, a clause he insisted on including, and that I signed without fully understanding, 4 years earlier, that I was signing the instrument of my own vindication. I remember the afternoon I signed it, sitting in Theodore's office on the 30th floor of a building downtown, the city spread out gray and rainy behind him, and asking him why he was including a clause that seemed to assume someone would one day try to destroy me. And Theodore had looked at me over his reading glasses and said that in 30 years of buying into troubled companies, he had learned one reliable thing: that the person who quietly holds a company together is the person the founder eventually comes to fear, and that fear, given enough time, always looks for a knife. I had thought at the time he was being cynical. I understood at the anniversary gala that he had simply been reading the future more clearly than I could. The stake I held was not enormous in the way that word usually means. It would not have made me rich if I sold it. But it was enough that under the firm's own governing documents, I could not be treated as a disposable employee, could not be quietly fired and smeared and walked out a side door because I was, whether Roland remembered it or not, an owner of the thing he was trying to use to bury me. 6 weeks after that gala, after I had been suspended pending an internal investigation, after 2 clients I had personally managed for years put their contracts on hold citing the uncertainty, after my own assistant stopped making eye contact with me in the hallway, Roland arranged what he called an all-hands integrity meeting, held in the largest conference room we had, with the entire staff present and, joining by video on the wall screen, the 3 client representatives whose accounts he claimed I had compromised. He stood at the head of the long table with a slide deck projected behind him, showing timestamps and file names and a flowchart with arrows running from my name to the logo of the rival studio, Coastline Creative, a firm run by a former Meridian employee named Gregory Pratt, who had left on bad terms 4 years earlier and whom Roland now described as my secret collaborator. He looked directly at me while he clicked through slide after slide, and he used the word betrayal 3 times in 6 minutes. And each time he said it, his voice cracked a little more. And I watched some of my own colleagues, people I had trained, people whose weddings I had attended, start to nod along. A senior account manager named Beth, someone I had mentored for 6 years the way Roland once mentored me, actually turned her chair slightly away from me, a small physical movement that cut deeper than anything on the screen. One of the clients on the video wall, a man from a regional bank whose rebrand I had personally led, said he wanted a full accounting before his institution continued any relationship with the firm. And Roland nodded gravely and said, of course, transparency was the only way forward. And he said it looking straight at me. I sat through all of it without speaking, which took everything I had, because Daniel's words were still with me, that a person defending herself looks guilty. And I had decided somewhere in that hospital hallway that I was not going to give Roland the reaction his whole performance was built to provoke. I watched him work the room the way I had watched him work clients for a decade. The calibrated pauses, the way he'd lower his voice so people leaned in, the practiced trick of appearing to withhold his own judgment while steering everyone toward it. And I understood for the first time that the charm I had admired for 11 years was simply a tool, and that a tool doesn't care whose hand it's in or what it's used to build or break. He had a printed folder for every person in the room, tabbed and highlighted, and he walked the staff through it page by page. And I noticed that the pages were arranged to tell a story rather than to inform, that every timestamp that helped his case was in bold, and every fact that might complicate it was simply absent. And I thought, watching him, that this was a man who had spent 2 months building a weapon and calling it an investigation. Right in the middle of that meeting, while Roland was building toward whatever he thought his closing blow would be, my phone buzzed against the table, and it was a call from a hospital 200 miles away, where my father had been admitted the night before, with what the doctors were still calling a possible cardiac event, a call I had been dreading since my brother texted me at 4 that morning. I stepped out into the hallway to take it, my hands not quite steady, and for 6 minutes, none of Roland's slides mattered at all. There was only my brother's tired voice explaining that the tests were inconclusive, that our father was stable but frightened, that he'd been asking whether I was okay because our mother had let slip something about trouble at my job. I stood in that empty hallway with the fluorescent lights humming and realized my father, lying in a hospital bed with wires taped to his chest, was worried about me. And something about that rearranged what mattered in a way that Roland's flowchart could not touch. My husband Daniel found me there a few minutes later, having driven across town the moment I texted him the word help, and he didn't try to fix anything. He just put his hand flat between my shoulder blades and let me breathe. He told me something I kept turning over afterward, that his own mother had been pushed out of a business she co-founded decades ago by a partner who spread exactly this kind of story, and that she'd spent years so consumed with proving her innocence that she missed most of his childhood, and that he was not going to watch me disappear into the same hole. I told him I wasn't sure I could stay calm through the rest of that meeting, and he said I didn't have to be calm. I just had to be right, and being right could wait for the moment it would land hardest. Daniel told me one more thing while we stood in that hallway, that during the 6 weeks I'd spent suspended and sleepless, he had watched me start to believe the version of events Roland was selling, watch me lie awake asking whether I had somehow, without meaning to, done something that made this possible, and that this was the real damage a story like Roland's did. Not the accusation itself, but the way it made the accused person start auditing their own memory for crimes they never committed. He said the most important thing I could do walking back into that room was to stop defending myself and start simply showing what was true, because a person defending themselves looks guilty, and a person presenting facts looks like the floor under the accuser. My brother texted a photo then. Our father sitting up in the hospital bed, giving a weak thumbs up with a tube taped to the back of his hand, and underneath it said, "He wants you to know he never believed a word of it, not for 1 second." And something in my chest that had been clenched for 6 weeks finally loosened. We stood there another minute, and my father called back himself to say the cardiologist thought it was stress and not his heart, and I laughed for the first time in weeks, a short broken sound, and my father said, in the gruff way he says the things that matter most, that stress was a rich man's word for what a good daughter carries when bad men lie about her, and to go finish it. I straightened my jacket and told Daniel it was time to go back in. So when I walked back into that conference room, I didn't raise my voice. I asked Roland evenly whether he'd mind if I introduced someone before he continued, and before he could answer, a man near the back of the room who had been sitting quietly the entire time stood up, and I watched Roland's face change because he recognized him instantly. Theodore Ashworth, managing partner of the private equity firm that had saved Meridian from collapse 4 years earlier, and that still held a controlling interest in its debt. Theodore was not on the guest list. Theodore had not been invited. Theodore had received a call from me 2 days earlier and had cleared his afternoon without hesitation. Before Roland finishes, Theodore said, his voice carrying easily without any need for the microphone. I think everyone here should understand that any public accusation of disloyalty against a shareholder of this firm automatically triggers a governance review under the recapitalization agreement, a review my firm is contractually required to conduct, and I've already begun it. Roland said, too quickly, that this was an internal personnel matter and had nothing to do with the ownership structure. And Theodore said, mildly, that it had everything to do with the ownership structure, because the person Roland was accusing of stealing from the company happened to own a larger stake in it than anyone in the room except Roland himself. The sound that moved through that conference room was not quite a gasp. It was more like the sound of 30 people recalculating everything at once. And I watched Beth, who had turned her chair away from me, slowly turn it back. I asked for the projector, and Roland hesitated. And Theodore said, "Let her speak, Roland. You've had 6 minutes." And there was enough steel under the mildness that Roland stepped back. I pulled up an email chain on the screen, one that had been forwarded to me anonymously 3 weeks earlier from an address I didn't recognize. An act of conscience by someone I still don't know for certain, though I have my suspicions. The chain began 4 months before the gala. An email from Roland's personal account to Gregory Pratt at Coastline Creative. The same Gregory Pratt Roland had just spent 6 minutes describing as my secret collaborator. And in it, Roland proposed a quiet arrangement that Gregory's studio would receive certain Meridian concept files in exchange for a referral fee routed through a consulting invoice, and that they'd need a story ready in case anyone noticed the leak. I read the operative sentence aloud, the one where Roland wrote that they should build the paper trail so it pointed at Ava, since her fingerprints are already on the files and no one will question it. The room went very still. A designer near the front, a young woman named Carmen I had hired straight out of school, put her hand over her mouth. Roland said the email was fabricated, that anyone could forge a header, and I said that was a fair point, and moved to the second piece. The client from the regional bank, still on the video wall, the one who had demanded a full accounting, said loudly that he had heard enough, that his institution had nearly severed a relationship with the person who had actually done excellent work for them, based on the word of the person who had actually stolen from them, and he wanted that on the record. Beth, the account manager who had turned her chair away, stood up and said to the whole room that she had believed Roland for 6 weeks and she was ashamed of it, and that she'd watched me train half the people in this room and never once seen me cut a corner, let alone betray a client. Carmen, the young designer, was crying openly. Roland tried one more time, saying that the context was more complicated than a few documents could capture, that he'd made mistakes, but his intentions had always been to protect the firm. And Theodore Ashworth cut him off, not unkindly, saying that intentions were a matter for Roland's lawyer now, and that as of that moment, Roland was relieved of his operational role pending the completion of the review. The client from the regional bank asked, still on the video wall, whether the person who had actually done the excellent work on his rebrand could be put back on his account immediately, because he had never wanted her removed in the first place. And 2 other client representatives on the wall nodded and said versions of the same thing. Our lead developer, the one who had lowered his phone at the gala, stood up and said he'd worked beside me for 4 years and had spent 6 weeks feeling sick that he hadn't said anything, and that he was saying it now, that anyone who knew me knew Roland's story never made sense. The room was turning the way a tide turns. not all at once, but all in one direction, and I could see it moving across people's faces. The recalibration, the shame, the slow arithmetic of everyone realizing they had believed a polished man over a quiet one. Someone near the back, I never found out who, said the word unbelievable under their breath, and it carried in the quiet. And I watched Roland understand, standing at the head of a table he had sat at the head of for 20 years, that the story he had built to destroy me had just collapsed on top of him, with the whole company watching. The consequences arrived over the following weeks, one after another, in the ordinary, unglamorous way that consequences actually arrive. The board, reviewing Theodore's findings, voted to remove Roland from all operational and creative authority, and the firm's outside counsel referred the matter of the diverted client concepts to the appropriate authorities, since the leaked files included work covered under client confidentiality agreements that carried real legal weight. Two of the firm's largest clients, learning that the disloyalty they'd been warned about had been fabricated, not only stayed but expanded their contracts, one of them writing that they valued a firm that handled an internal crisis with documentation rather than theatrics. Gregory Pratt's studio, Coastline Creative, lost its two biggest accounts within a month when word spread through the small industry that they had knowingly received stolen concept work. And an industry association Gregory sat on the board of quietly removed him after the details became widely known. Roland's own name, which had been on the door for 20 years, was removed from the firm's masthead by a board vote, and a Lifetime Achievement Award he'd been slated to receive from a regional design guild that spring was rescinded with a brief statement citing conduct inconsistent with the guild's values. Diane, Roland's wife, the woman who had warned me 2 years earlier at the coat check, called me the week after the meeting, not to defend her husband, but to tell me she was filing for divorce, that she had suspected for years he was capable of something like this, and had finally been shown proof she couldn't look away from. Gregory Pratt himself, facing the loss of his firm and a referral from Meridian's counsel to the authorities, attempted to settle quietly by turning over everything he had on Roland, in exchange for leniency, which only deepened the paper trail against the man who had recruited him. The Regional Design Guild that had rescinded Roland's award issued a rare public statement, and two universities, where Roland had been a guest lecturer for years, quietly removed him from their spring rosters once the story reached their faculty. A trade publication that had profiled Roland twice as a visionary ran a short, careful follow-up that never used the word fraud but laid out the governance findings in enough detail that anyone in the industry understood what had happened. And within a month, Roland's name, which had opened every door in that city for 2 decades, had become the kind of name people lowered their voices to mention. And my old assistant, the one who had stopped making eye contact with me in the hallway, left a handwritten note on my desk, apologizing, saying she'd been afraid of losing her job if she was seen supporting me, and that watching me stay steady had taught her something about the kind of person she wanted to become. Roland asked to meet me 2 months later, and I almost said no, but in the end, I agreed to a single cup of coffee at a diner near the old office. Mostly, I think, because 11 years is a long time to simply erase. He looked older than I remembered, thinner, and he wrapped both hands around a mug he never drank from. And he said he was sorry. that watching clients ask for me by name year after year had built something in him he never learned how to name, that somewhere along the way, pride had curdled into something he didn't recognize, that he had told himself he was protecting the firm when he was really just protecting his place at the top of it, and that he understood if I never wanted to see him again, but he was asking anyway, because I was the best thing that had ever happened to the company he built, and he had thrown me under a bus in front of 300 people to keep from having to admit it. I let him finish. I told him I had spent a long time in that hospital hallway, deciding what kind of person I wanted to be on the other side of this. And the answer was not cruelty, but it was also not forgetting. I hope you find some peace, Roland, I said. But you had my loyalty for 11 years, and you decided your ego mattered more than 11 years of loyalty. I'm not going to hand you a second chance to spend the same way. He asked me, before he stood, whether there was anything he could do to make it right, any way back at all. And I told him the truth, that the only thing that would have made it right was not doing it in the first place, and that this was the hard arithmetic of betrayal, that some things cannot be repaired after the fact, because the damage is not in the aftermath, but in the choice itself, in what the choice reveals about who a person was willing to be. He asked whether I hated him, and I told him no, that hatred would have meant he still occupied that much space in my life, and that what I actually felt was closer to the way you feel about a house you used to live in that has since burned down, a sadness with no anger left in it, because the thing worth being angry about was already gone. He nodded like he had expected exactly that, and he left his coffee untouched on the table, and I watched him walk out through the same door I had walked through 1,000 times as a young designer who thought she owed this man everything. And I sat there alone for a while afterward, not triumphant, just tired, in the particular way that comes after you finally set down something you have been carrying for 11 years without realizing how heavy it was. That night I drove the 2 hours to see my father, who was home from the hospital and stronger every day, and I found him sitting on the back porch with my mother and my brother, the three of them arguing cheerfully about a card game, and my father made me sit down and eat before he'd let me say a single word about work. We stayed out on that porch until the mosquitoes drove us in, my father telling the same story he always tells about the summer. He taught me to change a tire on the side of a highway because he said a daughter of his was never going to be stranded waiting on a man, and my mother reaching over at some point to squeeze my hand without either of us saying why. My brother, who had driven through the night when our father was admitted and had held the family together while I was 200 miles away, drowning in Roland's story, asked me at one point whether I felt vindicated. And I told him honestly that vindication was a smaller feeling than I'd expected, that clearing my name in front of 300 people had not undone the 6 weeks of lying awake, auditing my own memory, and that the thing I actually felt was closer to grief. Grief for 11 years of a mentorship I'd believed was real. My father overheard, and he said, in his blunt way, that the mentorship had been real, that Roland had taught me a great deal, and that a thing could be both real and poisoned, and that I would spend less of my life in pain if I let myself hold both of those truths at once instead of choosing between them. I have thought about that sentence more than almost anything anyone said to me that entire year. A few weeks later, the board, on Theodore Ashworth's recommendation, offered me the role of creative director with a formal seat that reflected the ownership stake I'd held quietly for 4 years. And I accepted. And the first thing I did was call Carmen and Beth into my office to tell them nothing about how we treated each other in this firm was going to work the way it had under Roland. I put a partnership track in writing that week, the same one Roland had told me the timing was never right for. And I opened it not just to myself, but to anyone at the firm who earned it, because I had spent 11 years watching a man hoard credit as if it were a finite resource. And I had decided that the firm I wanted to build would be one where the person who saved the account got to stand on the stage and accept the award themselves. I kept my grandmother's commercial property, the one I'd borrowed against to buy my stake, and I hung a photograph of her in my new office where I could see it from my desk, because she was the one who taught me, long before Roland taught me anything about design, that you never hand someone else the deed to a thing you built with your own hands. But the part I keep coming back to happened later, when Theodore and I were closing out the last of the governance paperwork, and he mentioned, almost in passing, that the anonymous email chain that broke the whole case open had come to me from an address he'd since traced, and that it hadn't come from Diane, as I'd assumed, and it hadn't come from anyone at Coastline. It had come from Beth, my own mentee, the woman who had turned her chair away from me in that meeting. Theodore laid it out carefully because he could see it was landing hard, that the email address had been created and used exactly once from a device that connected to the office network on an evening when the access log showed only a handful of people in the building, and that when his team narrowed it down, Beth's name was the only one that fit. She had found the emails weeks before the gala, buried in a shared folder Roland had carelessly left accessible during a server migration, had understood immediately what they meant, and had been too frightened to come forward openly, because Roland still controlled her salary, her reference, her entire professional future, and coming forward meant betting all of it on whether anyone would believe a mid-level account manager over the founder. So she had done the thing frightened people do. She had tried to have it both ways, forwarding me the truth from an anonymous address so it would exist in my hands if I ever needed it, while publicly keeping her chair turned toward Roland, so that if the evidence failed, if the room sided with him, she would not go down with me. She had played both sides until she was certain which one was safe, and the turn chair in that meeting had not been indifference. It had been terror wearing the mask of indifference. When I confronted her about it, gently, in my office with the door closed, she admitted all of it: the fear, the anonymous forward, the turned chair, the night she'd lain awake hating herself for, the cowardice and unable to overcome it. And she put her resignation letter on my desk before I could ask for it. And I sat with that letter for a long moment, because the person who had saved me was also the person who had been ready to let me fall if the evidence hadn't held. And I did not know, in that moment, which of those two facts was supposed to win. I think about that a lot now, the strange arithmetic of it, that the woman who handed me the truth was also the woman who would have watched me drown to keep herself dry, and that both of those things were real at the same time. I didn't accept her resignation in the end because I understood something about fear that I hadn't understood before that year. That most people are neither heroes nor villains, but simply afraid. And that the measure of a person isn't whether they're brave when it's free, but what they do when being brave might cost them everything. And Beth had, at least, done the frightened, imperfect, half brave thing of sending me the truth when staying silent would have been easier. I kept her on. I promoted her eventually. Because talent is talent, and because I decided the firm I wanted to lead had room for people who had been afraid once, and chose in the end to do the right thing badly rather than the wrong thing well. But I did it with my eyes open, and I told her so, that I knew exactly what she had done and exactly what she had not had the courage to do, and that trust, real trust, would have to be rebuilt slowly and might never fully return, and that I was offering her a future at this firm, but not a clean slate because clean slates were a fiction, and the two of us both knew it. She cried when I said it, not the performed crying Roland had done at the gala, but the exhausted crying of someone finally set down after carrying something heavy for months. And she said she understood, and she stayed. And over the following 2 years, she became one of the most reliable people I have ever worked with, which taught me something I am still turning over, that the people who have failed a test of courage once are sometimes the ones who will never fail it again, precisely because they cannot forgive themselves for the first time. I think about that oak-paneled conference room a lot, the one where a mentor tried to rewrite 11 years of my life in front of 300 people, and the one where weeks later, the truth arrived one document at a time and rearranged the whole room. If you have ever had someone you trusted completely stand up in front of a crowd and tell a story about you that you barely recognized, you already know that the hardest part isn't proving them wrong. It's deciding who you want to become while you do it. So let me ask you something before you go. If the person who saved you turned out to be the same person who almost let you fall, could you forgive them? Or is that a line you couldn't cross? Tell me in the comments. And if this story was worth your time tonight, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too.